everyone, and welcome to our lessons on investigation designs. So this fits into our topic of Introduction to Psychology. So today we will be looking at 3 investigation designs that researchers use. Researchers use this to research differences between groups and make associations between variables. They also help researchers to ask precise questions and produce evidence that can be verified. So today we'll be looking at 3 separate investigation designs. The 3 that we'll be looking at are the experimental design, the quantitative observational design, and the qualitative design. So what I would like you to know about or understand about the 3 designs is I would like you to know the advantages and disadvantages of all 3. I would like you to understand each of their essential features, and I would also like you to explain the differences between them. So today we're going to start with the experimental design. So within the experimental design, people use this design to research and identify causal links between variables. Researchers use this to manipulate the independent variable. The experimental design can investigate the differences between groups or relationships between variables, and within this experimental design you can measure and test results quantitatively. So within the experimental design, you are identifying links between 2 variables. Now, these variables are the independent variable and the dependent variable. Now, if you don't know the differences between these 2 variables, I'll be explaining them within class and also be explaining them on the next slide. So if you do not know, don't be scared. I'll explain them a bit further. So an example that we can use for an experimental design, we could ask the question, what effect does consumption of breakfast have on test results? So the 2 variables that we would be looking at are the consumption of breakfast, which is the independent variable, and then the test results, which is the dependent variable. So the variables that are within the experimental design are the independent variable. So this variable is manipulated or changed. The dependent variable, this variable is measured, so the test results, and the controlled variable, which is all the other variables that remain constant throughout our experiment. So the essential features within the experimental design are that the experimental design involves 2 separate groups. So these 2 separate groups are the experimental and the controlled group. So I'll explain them a little bit further. So the experimental group is the group that is exposed to the independent variable. So in this case, that independent variable is the consumption of breakfast. This group is also known as the experimental condition because you are experimenting with this group. The experimental group is also the group the experimenters are really interested in because this is where you're going to see a change in the way that the group is behaving because you are experimenting with their consumption of breakfast, for example. The other group that is within the experimental design is the controlled group. So the controlled group, on the other hand, is the group that is not exposed to the independent variable. So you need a group that the experimental group is being compared to, and that is the controlled group. So the controlled group may not be eating breakfast in this case. The other essential feature within an experimental design is random allocation. So all participants need to have an equal opportunity to be allocated to either the experimental or the controlled group. This helps us to control any extraneous variables that could happen within this experimental design. It also helps us to represent the larger population, as the larger population involves random people, so different ages, different genders, etc. The experimental design also includes pre and post testing. So you need to pre and post test both of the experimental and control groups before and after the study so that you can compare if the independent variable has made any difference. So I'm going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages within the experimental investigation design. So the advantages are that this can be controlled. So because you can control what is happening to the independent variable, this leads to more accurate results because you also have your control group, so the group that is not eating breakfast. This means that you can infer causality. So you have evidence to say that one variable is changing the other variable. Another advantage is that you are random, as I said before, random allocation. So this leads to the elimination of extraneous variables. Okay, so the disadvantages of the experimental design is that it is not always possible to eliminate these extraneous variables. I'll explain this a bit further in class. Another disadvantage is that the experimental situation may not relate to real-world experiences. So because this is a experiment, it may not be exactly like real life. So sometimes it's hard to say that this is exactly what will happen in a real-life situation. Another disadvantage is that an experiment may be unethical or impossible. So it may be unethical or impossible to randomly assign people to groups. So, for example, you can't deliberately deprive children of sleep if you are trying to conduct a experiment on deprivation of sleep on children. That would be considered very unethical. Another one is the effect of jet lag. So that would be impossible to conduct an experiment on because it'd be very expensive to have a group of people being flown around the world. Another one is that it is unethical to observe punishment on children. So you are not allowed to do that, obviously, for obvious reasons, and therefore it would be we would be unable to run that kind of experiment on punishment on children. Okay, so the second investigation design that we'll be looking at is quantitative observational design. So this is used when a researcher wants to test quantitative data by observing pre-existing variables. So we are looking at numerical data and also pre-existing variables, which I will explain further in a little bit. So this numerical data could include height, weight, percentages, heart rate, etc. Now, because we are using this numerical data, it actually makes it easier and faster to summarize and collect the data. Okay, so the essential features for quantitative observational investigation design is that the collection of quantitative data by observing pre-existing criteria and variables. Okay, sorry, I'll start that again. So an essential feature is that you are observing pre-existing criteria or variables. So for example, I've got here red cars. So say you are researching something about the amount of red cars people have in the Glenelg area. So this is pre-existing criteria. The red cars that people have already exists. Another essential feature is that it can investigate the differences in groups and associations between the variables. Another is that it is used, so we use the quantitative observational method when it may be impossible for the experimenter to manipulate the predictor. For example, you can't manipulate someone's age, their gender, their ethnicity level, or level of intelligence. Therefore, you would be using the quantitative observational method if you were going to be looking at these variables. It is also used when it may be unethical to manipulate the predictor. So, for example, the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure on children's scores on an intelligence test. You cannot do that because that is unethical. And you also use this design when it may be too costly to conduct the experiment. So, for example, it was too costly to look at the jet lag. So the key difference between this method and the experimental method is that there is no random allocation because these groups are already exist. Therefore, you cannot have an experimental and a controlled group. Okay, so its advantages and disadvantages. So the advantages are that it allows variables to be tested which aren't ethical or impossible to conduct, which I explained previously. It also is conducted in a natural setting, so you can. So within this design, you can say that this is actually what would happen in a real life situation. The disadvantages of the quantitative observational design is that it cannot you cannot infer causal effect, as there may be too many extraneous variables. You cannot replicate the findings because the same situation is very unlikely to happen this again. You can only apply the findings to the sample that you had in that particular setting, and it is also open to observer bias. Okay, qualitative design. So this is the third design that we'll be looking at. So this looks at qualitative data. So it's not looking at numerical data like percentages and numbers. We are looking at words and explanations. So someone having a discussion. The qualitative design focuses on answering a general question rather than answering or testing a hypothesis rather. It also can investigate the differences between groups and relationships between variables. So the essential features within a qualitative design is that it looks at verbal information. So we are looking at someone having a discussion and we are gathering the information through what they are saying to us. This enables us to have a rich understanding. So we are able to understand more deeply what their opinion is on a particular matter. So the qualitative investigation design is broken up into two designs. So we have the focus group and we have the Delphi technique. So I'm going to discuss both of these individually. Okay, so the focus group. So the focus group qualitative investigation design is an interview conducted from a trained facilitator. So you may have a really small group, so it's only from about 6 to 12 people. The data is collected through a discussion and it uses open-ended questions. So the trained facilitator will ask a question on a particular issue. So they may start their question with, "What do you think about?" And then the small group of 6 to 12 people will discuss that particular issue. So they are not asking closed questions. We do not want to gather information on yes or no answers. We want the people within this focus group to be discussing the issue at hand, and all the information that is presented to us, all the verbal information that they say and discuss is actually recorded. Okay, so the advantages of the focus group is that it is convenient. So you only need a small group of people, you will have a facilitator and you ask a couple of questions that they will discuss. The facilitator is just going to prompt them to keep discussing this issue. So you get deeper responses and richer data. Like I said before, because you're having a conversation and a discussion, you're more likely to get deeper responses out of people. It is easy to organise because there's a small group. It is also useful for young children because we are collecting verbal data. Because children may not be able to convey what they want to through writing something down. It is easier for us to collect the data from children if it is verbally. Another advantage is that we can encourage introverted people to contribute. So if you are an introverted person, you know that you may be a little bit nervous when you are talking one-on-one with someone. So an introverted person may want to contribute if they're in a larger group of people. They may just contribute a little bit, but they do feel like they are taking a step back from being in the spotlight. So then you may get a bit more out of them. The disadvantages of a focus group are you gaining a true response? So because there is a group of people, you are a little bit less likely to be gaining a true response just because you may feel like people participants may feel like they are being judged on the issue at hand. So they may not really talk about what they really feel about the particular topic. Domination of strong personalities. So if you have an extroverted personality in your focus group, they are more likely to dominate the conversation. Therefore, the facilitator does need to try and get everyone involved rather than just one or two participants. Another disadvantage is interviewer bias. So the facilitator may be a little bit biased on the situation at hand. And the last disadvantage is that you cannot generalize results to a wider population because you only have a small sample size. Okay, so the second qualitative investigation design technique is the Delphi technique. So this technique is also a small group, but the difference between the focus group and the Delphi technique is that all of these people do not need to be in one place at one time. Another difference is that they are experts in the field at hand, so they are not just a random sample of people. All of the people within the Delphi technique actually have something to do with the topic at hand, so they're experts in that field. The aim of the Delphi technique is therefore to generate a general agreement about that issue or problem that these experts have. Therefore, it may take time because they need to reach a general consensus on the issue. The Delphi technique has a particular process that we run through, and I'll actually discuss this in class rather than on here. So the advantages to a Delphi technique. So it is easy to organise because you don't need to get the group together. It's easy to just give out, say, the questions that you will be discussing via email, etc. It is inexpensive to conduct. Another advantage is that you get expert data, and that then becomes rich data. So because the issue at hand is being discussed by people that are within the particular field, you are able to get better data. And it is also confidential because they are not all in one place at one time, and they therefore they don't know what everyone else is saying on the particular topic. The disadvantages of the Delphi technique are that you need a consensus, therefore it's going to take a little bit more time. This also may lead to a weakened opinion because people may need to change their opinion just a little bit just to reach the consensus. The other disadvantage is that the results can't be generalised to the wider population because of the small sample. And the last is that the participants cannot discuss the issue. Okay, so I've now discussed the three different investigation designs, so you have a little bit of a better understanding of the three. I'd like you to just write down a couple of the questions that you may have on the three designs, because in class we'll be discussing them a little bit further and also doing a couple of activities. So remember that I'd like you to know the differences between the three. I'd like you to know their advantages and disadvantages, and I'd also like you to be able to explain the differences between them. Now, the last thing before class, I would like you to just look at this issue. So I'd like you to discuss the possible research designs that you would consider to answer the following question. So the question that I'd like you to look at is, are girls really better drivers than boys? I'd like you to justify that selection. So looking at the three designs, which are experimental, quantitative, observational, and qualitative, what do you think would be best to use on the question, are girls really better drivers than boys? Thank you for listening.